greatest prosperity, relatively speaking, in material terms, that humankind has ever known. And we were able to enjoy that level of prosperity and relative peace based on a global rules-based trading system, largely patrolled and protected by the United States with our regional allies in different parts of the world, in Asia, Europe, the Middle East, Africa, and of course here in the Caribbean and in Latin America. And what's important to note now, ladies and gentlemen, pardon me, is the return of what I would call maritime geography as a principal facet in understanding international relations, international trade, and diplomacy. And what is happening right before our eyes in the last several months is direct challenges of this global rules-based order, very starkly by Russia, but over the last 10 years by China as well, where we now face a situation where we have three nuclear-armed great powers in a much more multipolar world than we saw over the prior 3 decades of the US largely dominating global trade, commerce, and diplomacy. So I'd like to start out with Russia because the Russia-Ukraine war is consuming all of the oxygen everywhere we are in the last several months. And Russia, I would call, ladies and gentlemen, a persistent and revisionist power that is often mocked because its GDP is the size of much smaller countries. But let's take a look at its geography for a second, because it is a country that occupies 1/8 of the world's landmass within its borders alone. It spans 11 time zones. And as you can see, Russia is able to project power in Asia, in the Western Pacific, in South Asia, especially with its very deep arms relations with India, in the Middle East, as we've seen with its presence in Syria since 2015, in Northern Africa, with its involvement now in the Libyan civil war, and of course in what it considers to be its sphere of influence in Eastern and Central Europe, and that is embodied by the invasion of Ukraine, because Vladimir Putin, rightly or wrongly, and this is not an apology for Putin, but you need to understand your adversary's perceptions to be able to engage in international diplomacy and competition. He believes that Ukraine is essentially a non-existent country that has no right to exist, and that it should be subsumed by Russia because of historical and civilizational purposes. So we need to be very serious about how we deal with Russia for several reasons. One is that it actually has a nuclear arsenal larger than that of the United States. And for the first time since the early 1980s, those of you who may be of my generation recall the very intense debates over nuclear deployment in Europe. We now have on a day-to-day basis Russian generals that are convening in the Security Council in Moscow discussing the possible use of tactical nuclear weapons if there are any major setbacks to Russian military operations in Ukraine. So the relative peace that we've known for the last 30 to 35 years, push that aside. We're talking about the return of nuclear strategy on a warfare basis for the first time in most of your lifetimes, for that matter. In addition to its nuclear superpower status, many of us have been reminded, all of you here, you're very well informed and very highly educated, but most of the world didn't realize what a commodity superpower Russia has been all of these years, not only in terms of hydrocarbons, but also in terms of natural resources such as timber, diamonds, critical metals, rare earth minerals, and of course, foodstuffs and fertilizers that are so essential to the well-being of many countries, many markets, and many societies, especially in Northern Africa and in the Middle East. And what we learned the last several months in many ways is what an utter stranglehold Russia has had over the energy imports that power Europe, power its economies, and heat Europeans' homes. And this is the result of a deliberate strategy by former Chancellor Angela Merkel, who believed that change through trade, that is, that Russia and the European Union would become increasingly interdependent, would negate the possibility of war, completely underestimating Vladimir Putin's willingness to go to war to achieve imperial Russian ambitions in Ukraine and perhaps elsewhere in the former Soviet Union. And now, of course, Europe is under a mad dash, and probably a very unrealistic one, to quickly transition from hydrocarbons to renewables, when Europe's likely future will be increased dependence on natural gas and perhaps even oil for several decades as it transitions to an eventual renewables infrastructure grid. And we'll touch on that again before the end of the discussion. Now, Vladimir Putin claimed that the possibility that Ukraine would be brought into the NATO alliance was one of the major triggers for the invasion of Ukraine. And he was open about this, ladies and gentlemen. In 2007, he gave a speech at the Munich Security Conference, and he stated very bluntly, Ukraine can never become a member of the NATO alliance. Now, he didn't say what he would do if NATO was serious about bringing Ukraine in, but he was serious that this was a red line issue for him. And we in the United States and our NATO allies largely ignored Vladimir Putin for the last 15 years. And now he's made his perception of vulnerability very well known, at tremendous cost to Ukraine, and obviously with significant disruptions to global supply chains and disruptions to the well-being of a number of societies that could have blowback effects later this year and into 2023. But one great error on Putin's part was that not only is, Ukraine was never going to be coming into NATO. That's been a dream of many Europeans and some Americans, but it really hasn't been talked about in any serious fashion, except as a talking point to try to keep Vladimir Putin off balance. But Russia's NATO borders may soon double with the admission of Sweden, but especially Finland, with its 830-mile border with Russia, which effectively doubles Russia's exposure to the NATO alliance, and I presume, if I were to believe Vladimir Putin, making Russia even more insecure after having invaded Ukraine and then leading to a triggering event that's bringing in Sweden and Finland. Sometime, it'll take several years, and we'll see to what extent some NATO countries object. And I'm not even persuaded, ladies and gentlemen, that there's going to be unanimity in the US Senate on this issue, because it's going to come down to what can the United States actually afford in terms of defending more and more countries. And as we talk about, tactical nuclear weapons possibly being used in Europe, what the Article 5 commitment actually comes down to is what cities and countries in Europe is the United States willing to potentially sacrifice New York or Washington or Boston for in a war with Russia. So we'll see how this plays out. There's going to be a NATO summit in Madrid later this month, and that will be where Finland and Sweden seek permission. Those invitations will be accepted, or those requests to be admitted, and then the process will play out for several years. This is a UK Defense Intelligence map of the situation in Ukraine as of 2 days ago. And you probably have followed the reports over the last several evenings that President Zelensky has admitted that about 20% of Ukraine is now effectively controlled by Russia. But what's more important than the size of the territory is what Russia now controls. And that is the industrial heartland and the most fertile agricultural lands in Ukraine, in the Donbass region in eastern and southern Ukraine. Also, the very important strategic area here of the Crimea Peninsula, which houses Russia's Black Sea naval fleet. And almost as importantly for down the road, depending on how hopeful negotiations may be transacted, Russia will effectively control Ukraine's ability to export industrial products and agricultural products through the Black Sea to markets. The degree to which Russia is able to control Kyiv's government policies and to coerce it to adopt pro-Russian policies is going to be one of the key strategic outcomes here. And again, it all depends on how long the war takes to play out and to what degree Putin and Zelensky are persuaded to come to the negotiating table. And I just want to expose a fallacious statement that we've been seeing in the media lately, ladies and gentlemen, that somehow the world has come together to punish Putin and to make very clear that what he's done in Ukraine is unacceptable. And that's simply not true. I mean, it's the global West, I would posit, the United States and Canada, Commonwealth countries, some, not all, and certainly Western Europe and Japan. But most of the world is sitting out the sanctions regime against Russia. They consider the Ukraine war a European internal matter, and they're more interested in advancing their own economic well-being and national security interests, which they feel are not being threatened by Russia's military operations in Ukraine. So Brazil needs to ensure that it's able to import valuable fertilizer from Russia. right? Brazil being such an important breadbasket agricultural exporter to world markets. South Africa, India, which is dependent on Russia for hydrocarbons and for massive arms deliveries to defend India against China and against Pakistan. So these are going to be the core national security interests that are driving decisions by individual countries, as opposed to the sense that somehow the world has come together. It is not. And this map here will show you which countries have voted to actually impose sanctions on Russia. And as you see, most of the world is not engaged at all in any type of serious sanctioning of Russia. Now, I would believe, and I have no evidence of this, that when Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping met in February of this year at the Beijing Olympics, that they announced shortly after their meeting a joint partnership agreement that would be without limits and without any forbidden areas of cooperation involving trade, involving diplomacy, involving security, involving investment, involving infrastructure. I won't call this a strategic alliance, but it's certainly a very valuable, convenient, tactical partnership between two nuclear powers. And of course, China is a manufacturing superpower complementing Russia as a commodity superpower. But they've essentially declared the United States the greatest threat to global peace and security, and they're determined to upend this global rules-based trading system that we described earlier in the presentation. And the degree to which these two gentlemen are going to be dominating Eurasia in the years ahead, given that Vladimir Putin is 70 and the Russian constitution was recently amended so that he could potentially win re-election in 2024 and serve out 2 6-year terms and rule Russia until he's 83 or so, unless a supposed illness he may have falls him or he's assassinated. And then you have Xi Jinping, who is 68 years old and has one overriding objective right now, ladies and gentlemen, and that is to secure his 3rd term as General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party at what's expected to be the National Party Congress this fall, probably in November. It's unprecedented in recent Chinese history because since Deng Xiaoping, every Chinese General Secretary has served 2 5-year terms. And the question now is Xi Jinping looking to serve as essentially a dictator for life in China, given how he's consolidated power based on his General Secretariat of the Chinese Communist Party, which affords him the title of President of the People's Republic of China and also as Chairman of the Chinese Military Commission in China, so that he controls the party, the government, and the military, all around one individual. Now, I don't blame Xi Jinping for the kind of economic policies that have been undertaken since he came to power in 2012 and following on those that preceded him really since the 1990s, but especially after the US led the international effort to welcome China into the World Trade Organization in 2001. But we tend to be a little bit ahistorical, ladies and gentlemen, and think about history in a very modern context. But as you see here, for about 1,800 years, China was the world's largest economy until the mid-19th century when it encountered the British Empire. And for a number of reasons which are not immediately germane, went into very significant collapse. That continued through the Chinese communist takeover in 1949 and really only began to reverse itself with the liberalization of the Chinese economy under Deng Xiaoping in the 1980s and certainly after 2001. So that now you have China as a global economic colossus, second only to the United States in terms of nominal GDP. And depending on the trend lines of the next several years, and we saw significant disruption in China in this quarter. We'll touch on that shortly because of these sort of inexplicable zero COVID policies that China has continued to maintain and is likely to maintain apparently through mid-2023. Until then, we don't see the Chinese economy fully reopening to the outside world. But we see here that since 2000, this sort of meteoric, truly astonishing rise in Chinese economic power, greatly facilitated by its entry into the World Trade Organization, because in Washington and in other capitals, but in Washington especially, I can speak from personal experience there, we had the bipartisan consensus that bringing China into the World Trade Organization would lead it towards a more liberalized, consensual style of governance away from authoritarian communism, and hopefully welcome China as a quote-unquote responsible stakeholder on the world stage. And the Chinese Communist Party obviously has very different designs for what China's global posture will be in the 21st century. So one of the things that the CCP has been undertaking is perhaps the most breathtaking and ambitious global infrastructure project ever devised. It's known as the Belt Road Initiative, and it essentially seeks to establish an independent global supply chain and infrastructure empire that is directed from Beijing. And when I say independent, I mean independent from the one that I provided to you in the initial slide of the US-led global rules-based trading system that the world has generally known since the end of World War II, but especially since the early 1990s. And China now is looking to establish an independent series of interconnectedness through projects such as bridges and dams and highways and railways, airports and seaports, and power generating plants, mostly throughout Eurasia, all the way out to Western Europe, increasingly into Africa, and now even into Latin America and the Caribbean. As many of you have been describing to me over the last 24 hours, you travel from island to island here in the Caribbean, and there are Chinese flags all over the place because of major investment projects that are seriously needed in many parts of the Caribbean. And unfortunately, it's been a neglectful US policy that has led to this larger, more generalized embrace of Chinese investment. So we see this increasing push of Chinese excess industrial capacity and excess labor capacity to other markets around the world. The Belt Road Initiative has slowed down somewhat in the last 2 years, largely because of COVID policies. It's unclear to what extent BRI will continue with the same level of energy as we saw in the prior decade, largely because so many governments are unable to repay the terms of these opaque agreements. Often there is corruption involved, especially at mid-level and local governmental levels. And you have a number of countries that have had their sovereign assets either seized or under threat of seizure by Chinese companies and investment institutions because they've been unable to repay the terms of these loans. And so a number of countries are now looking to renegotiate their agreements with Chinese institutions. And I think Beijing is getting a sense of pushback. So we'll see how BRI develops in the years to come. But the Caribbean is a fascinating place for analyzing what kind of very ambitious investment the Chinese government has undertaken. And again, I don't fault the Chinese one bit. They see so many opportunities to invest here in the Caribbean. We don't see that same level of engagement on the part of the United States and our private institutions or our government in the Caribbean, and for that matter, in Latin America more broadly. But we are very much concerned, not only because the Caribbean is so proximate to the United States, but there are very important economic and national security considerations from a completely objective perspective in Washington that I think create a compelling basis for greater Washington engagement throughout the region.